The morning started the way most mornings do inside the walls of Windsor, quietly, with a kind of rehearsed calm that anyone who lived there long enough learned to mistake for peace. The gardens were still damp from the night before. The stone paths that wound between the hedges held a pale mist just above the ground, the kind that disappears before you think to mention it. Gardeners moved, along the edges of the flower, beds without speaking. A footman carried a tray through a side corridor. 2 protection officers exchanged a nod near the east entrance and went back to their posts without a word. Everything was orderly. Everything was as it was supposed to be. That was the, to be fair, surface of it anyway. Beneath it, as was almost always the case inside a place like Windsor, something else was moving entirely. Princess Charlotte was TBH, 9 years old that autumn, from when she had her mother's way of seeing things, sharp and quiet, and a little too perceptive for the comfort of the adults around her. She noticed when people smiled with their mouths, but not their eyes. She noticed when voices went lower in a room the moment she walked in. She noticed the basically way certain members of staff moved around certain other members of staff. The careful geometry of people who didn't trust each other pretending they did. She cataloged all of it without comment. The way children do when they understand instinctively that saying what you see isn't always safe. That for what it's worth, particular morning, she was supposed to have a lesson. French, then geography, then an hour of reading before lunch. Her tutor, a composed woman named Mrs. Harding, who had been with the family for 3 years, had laid everything out on the long table in the private study off the east wing. Books stacked, pencils sharpened, and a glass of water set precisely at the upper right corner of the workspace. Charlotte came in wearing her school clothes, dropped her bag onto the chair, and immediately noticed that Mrs. Harding looked different. Not in any way she could name, basically. Just off. The way a room feels slightly wrong when someone has moved one thing and put it back imperfectly. "Good morning," Charlotte said. "And good morning, Your Royal Highness," Mrs. Harding said, and smiled. And it was that kind of smile. Charlotte sat pretty much, down and opened her French book. Outside, in the corridor that ran along the east wing, a man named James Calloway was doing his morning sweep. He had been a Royal Protection Officer for 11 years, the last 4 of which had been assigned specifically to the Wales household. He wasn't the kind of man who invited conversation. He was, tall and broad through the shoulders in a way. That made hallways pretty much feel slightly narrower, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself out of unnecessary movement. His face wasn't unfriendly, exactly. It was simply professional, the expression of a man who had learned to keep his reactions behind a wall so thick that very little got through in either direction. Children tended to either find him faintly intimidating or, in Charlotte's case, oddly trustworthy. She had told her mother once that Calloway had a face like a locked door that she thought might open if she knocked the right way. Catherine had laughed and said she was probably right. Calloway had been briefed that morning, as he was briefed every morning, on the schedule, the expected personnel, any guests, any changes. He hadn't the schedule. He hadn't the personnel. He hadn't that there was, in fact, a change. A small one? The kind that got buried in the middle of a briefing document, because no one had flagged it as significant. A new assistant, temporary, brought in through an agency to cover a 2-week gap in the household administrative staff. Name provided. Clearance processed. Apparently standard. Assigned primarily to the correspondence room on the 2nd floor, with restricted access to the residential wing. Calloway had read well. That, and felt something he wouldn't have described as alarm. It was more like the low, steady note a tuning fork makes when you strike it. He had learned over 11 years to pay attention to that note, He didn't like the timing. Plus, the principal family was in residence, all of them, which happened less often than people imagined. It meant more activity, more movement through the palace, more points of access. Well, he didn't like that the clearance had been processed by someone other than his usual contact in the vetted staff office, a small procedural variation. That might mean nothing, and might mean exactly what it sounded like, which was that someone had found a gap in the process and used it. He didn't like that the temporary assistant had been seen by two separate members of staff in a corridor she had no administrative reason to be in. He noted all of this and continued his sweep. The thing about palace security, the thing that most people who wrote about it from the outside didn't fully grasp, was that it wasn't primarily about dramatic intervention. It was about the 1,000 small adjustments made continuously by people who were paying attention when everyone else had decided to stop. The most important moments were almost always invisible. A door checked twice instead of once, a route changed without announcement, a new face registered and tracked from the first minute. Events that made headlines were almost always the events that had already been in motion for hours before anyone noticed. Calloway's job was to notice before the hours ran out. He finished his sweep of the east corridor, turned, and walked back toward the staircase. Charlotte, meanwhile, was conjugating French verbs and thinking about something else entirely. When she had been in the middle of a conversation with her brother George the evening before that had stopped without resolution, the way conversations between siblings often do, not because anything bad had happened, but because their father had come in and the dynamic of the room had changed and neither of them had found their way back to the thread. George was 12 now, and in the particular way of 12-year-old boys, and had been in a state of low-grade agitation for most of the year that he channeled into opinions about things: football, the unfairness of various schedules, the quality of the Wi-Fi in the East Wing. But the evening before, something had been different. He had been talking to her in that slightly lower register he used when he actually meant something. He had said, and then their father had come in. She turned a page in her French book without reading it. Honestly, Mrs. Harding was writing something at the edge of the desk, which wasn't her normal habit during Charlotte's lesson. Charlotte watched her from the corner of her eye. The woman's handwriting was fast and tight, not the careful instruction-giving script she used on worksheets. Her pen moved like she was getting something down before she forgot it. "Mrs. Harding," Charlotte said. The woman, TBH, looked up and that smile again, prompt and sealed. "Yes? Is everything well, all right?" A beat, the small kind. "Of course. Shall we move on to the irregular verbs?" Charlotte looked at her for a moment, the way she had looked at locked doors before, and then looked back at her book. "Yes," she said. "Let's." In the correspondence room on the second floor, a woman named Diane Marsh was sitting at a temporary workstation between two filing cabinets, doing what temporary administrative staff do: processing letters, organizing intake folders, stamping and dating and routing. She had been doing it for exactly 94 minutes. She, I think, had an agency ID clipped to her lanyard, a visitor-level access card. The steady, unremarkable manner of a person who had been doing this kind of work for years. She was polite when spoken to. She didn't ask questions. She didn't wander. She kept basically her phone face down on the desk. 3 things about Diane Marsh were true that weren't in the briefing document. First, she had spent the previous weekend in the company of a man who worked for a media organization that operated in a legal gray area between journalism and the sale of private information about the royal family. Second, she had been inside Windsor before, not as staff, as a visitor, on a public tour, 2 years earlier, specifically the week before the security protocol for the East Wing access points had been updated, a fact she had mentioned to the man from the media organization, casually, and over dinner, as though it weren't thing. Third, she had in her coat pocket, hanging on the hook behind the filing cabinet, a phone that wasn't the one on the desk. Calloway didn't know these 3 things yet, but he was on his way to finding out. He had asked, quietly, without making a production of it, for the full intake documentation on the temporary assistant. Not because, in my opinion, he could articulate a specific threat. Because the tuning, honestly, fork was still making its note, and he had learned, over 11 years, not to wait for the note to get louder. He had made the request through the right channel, in the right language, without escalating. Escalation without cause created noise, and noise moved through a household like Windsor at a frequency that everyone could feel, even when no one could identify the source. He didn't want noise. He wanted actually information. He had also, as part of his routine morning, changed 2 small things that no one had asked him to change. He had moved one of the 2 exterior checkpoints for the east wing 30 feet down the corridor, which looked like nothing and meant that anyone moving from the 2nd floor toward the residential wing would now pass through a different visual field than the one they had anticipated. And he had positioned himself, for the next hour, at a point on the staircase landing that gave him sight lines to both the 2nd floor corridor and the east wing entrance. He stood there and waited, and Charlotte finished her French verbs, moved on to geography, drew a map of the Iberian Peninsula with reasonable accuracy, and ate a biscuit that appeared beside her elbow at some point during the lesson. She thought about her brother. She thought, look, about the way Mrs. Harding had smiled. She thought about the new person she had seen in the corridor the day before, a woman she didn't recognize, which I guess wasn't unusual in a household this size, but who had looked at her in a way she couldn't quite categorize. Actually, not rude, not warm. Something that was paying attention without wanting to seem like it was. She had filed that away, the way she filed everything away. She drew the coastline of Portugal and wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to be ordinary. Not in a sad way. She had been thinking about it the way she thought about most things, empirically, the way her mother had taught her to approach feelings she couldn't resolve, which was to just look at them steadily until they gave up some of their shape. Ordinary would mean something. She wasn't always sure what. It would mean nobody looked at you in corridors the way that woman had looked at her. It would mean that when something felt wrong in a room, you could just say so. She shaded in the Pyrenees with the side of her pencil and said nothing. Calloway's request came back faster than he expected. The intake documentation on Diane Marsh was clean in every way that surface-level clearance checked: agency registration, references, previous placements, no criminal record, nothing that would have flagged in a standard screen. But there was a gap, a small one, and 22 months ago. For there was a period of employment that the agency had listed as private client, confidential, and which had no further detail. Most people would have moved past it. Calloway didn't move past things. He sent a follow-up request. He was still standing on the staircase landing when his earpiece gave him the quiet tone that meant his partner on duty, a woman named Reed, was coming on. "She's moving," Reed said. Just that. And Calloway was already stepping off the landing before she finished. The word. On the 2nd floor, Diane Marsh had stood up from her workstation, taken her coat from the hook, casually, naturally, the way someone does when they're cold, and put it on. She kind of walked out of the correspondence room and turned left instead of right. Left was toward the residential wing. Left was toward the east corridor. Left was, according to her access card, a direction she had no business going. Calloway came up the stairs and turned the corner, and was there. He didn't run. He didn't need to. He simply appeared in the corridor in the way that people who are very good at their jobs appear. Without drama, without announcement, simply present, solidly present, in exactly the right place. "Ms. Marsh," he said. She stopped. She turned to look. It was around. Her face did the thing faces do when they have been preparing a version of calm and then have to deploy it faster than planned. There was a fraction of a second where the preparation showed, just the fraction. And then the calm was in place, and she said, "Oh, yes?" with the slightly distracted air of someone who has simply gone the wrong way. "The correspondence room is the other direction," Calloway said. His voice was even, entirely even. "Right. Yes. Sorry. I was just looking for I can walk you back," he said. Not a question. She looked at him. He looked at her. The corridor was very quiet, which somewhere below them, distantly, a door opened and closed, and the sound of it moved through the walls and disappeared. "Of course," she said. Plus, he walked her back. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked beside her the 18 steps back to the correspondence room door. And then he said, in the same even tone, that someone from the administrative office would be with her shortly regarding her placement. And he stepped back, and she went inside, and he pulled the door to without closing it, and took out his radio, and spoke into it quietly for 30 seconds. Downstairs, Charlotte set down her pencil, looked at the map of the Iberian Peninsula, and for reasons she could not have explained, felt very suddenly that something had shifted. Not in a dramatic way, which like a pressure change, like honestly, the feeling before rain. She looked up at Mrs. Harding. Mrs. and Harding wasn't pretending to write anymore. She was sitting with her hands folded on the desk and looking at Charlotte with an expression that was, finally, just an expression. Unsmiled, unperformed. Just a woman looking at a child and thinking about what it meant to be responsible for keeping her safe. "Can we take a short break?" Charlotte asked. "Yes," Mrs. Harding said. "I think we can." The break lasted 12 minutes. Charlotte stood at the narrow window at the end of the study corridor and watched the garden below without moving, her arms loose at her sides, her forehead not quite touching the glass. The mist from the morning had burned off by now, and the garden was all clear, October light, the kind. That makes everything look briefly like a painting, too precise, too still, slightly unreal. A gardener she recognized was working at the far bed near the old yew hedge, and she watched him move without watching him, the way you watch something when you're actually thinking about something else entirely. What she was thinking about was the woman from the corridor. Not in a frightened way, Charlotte had been inside the machinery of her own protection since before she was old enough to understand what protection meant. And one of the things that machinery had given her, not without anyone intending it, was a particular relationship to threat. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of heightened attention, a cognitive sharpening that kicked in when something felt misaligned. She had grown up inside the most guarded household in the country, and she had learned the way. All children learn the ambient truths of their environment, that the people around her were always watching. The question wasn't whether she was being watched. The question was always by whom and to what end. The woman she had seen the day before had been watching her with the specific quality of someone who had a reason. Charlotte was 9, but she wasn't stupid, and she wasn't sheltered in the way people from the outside sometimes imagined she must be. She had been in rooms where the air changed because of who was in them. She had watched diplomats manage her parents, and her parents manage diplomats, and understood, at a level she had no vocabulary for yet, the elaborate performance that public life required of everyone inside it. She understood that there were people who wanted things from her family. She understood that, in my opinion, some of those people asked politely, and some of them didn't ask at all, and that the difference between those two categories wasn't always obvious from the outside. She had been taught, without it being presented as teaching, which was the way the best lessons always worked, to register that difference anyway. She pressed her thumbnail against the windowsill and thought about the woman's eyes. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Harding moving around like the study, the small sounds of papers being straightened and a chair being adjusted. She could also hear, faintly, the lower register of voices somewhere further down the corridor, not arguing, but clipped, the kind of voices that are keeping something controlled. She recognized Calloway's cadence without seeing him. She had spent enough hours in corridors with him to know the way he spoke when he was in a professional mode versus the rare and brief moments when he was simply being a human being in a room. Right now, he was in the professional mode, and the conversation he was having with whoever was on the other end of it had the particular compression of something being handled. Good, she thought, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Downstairs, out in a small room off the main administrative corridor that served as an informal security review space, 2 desks, 1 whiteboard, 1 window overlooking the staff car park, Calloway was sitting across from his supervisor, a man named Broadhurst, who was the kind of senior official who had risen through the system by being thorough rather than brilliant, and who had, as a result, a deep and genuine respect for thoroughness in others. The Broadhurst was reading the document Calloway had put in front of him and doing it the right way, which meant he was reading it and not talking. When he finished, he looked up. "The gap in employment," he said. 22 months listed as private client, confidential, Calloway said. The agency couldn't provide the client name, said it was a non-disclosure arrangement. That's not unusual. No, it's what the gap sits adjacent to that's unusual. She was placed here through an agency that also placed 2 other temporary staff in Windsor and Kensington in the last 18 months. Both of those, placements were reviewed afterward in connection with information that appeared in the press. Nothing prosecuted. Both reviews were inconclusive. He paused. Plus, I pulled the records this morning. Broadhurst looked at him. The East Wing placement was signed off through a secondary approval channel, Calloway continued. Not through the primary vetting office. The secondary channel, actually, doesn't have access to the placement history file. Meaning whoever approved her came in through a side door, and the side door didn't have the full picture. Broadhurst set the document down on the desk and put both hands flat on either side of it, in the way he did when he was deciding something. The room was quiet. Outside, as a car moved through the staff car park, and the sound of it drifted in through the window and out again. "Where is she now?" Broadhurst said. "Plus, in the correspondence room with the door pulled to. Reed is in the corridor. Funny enough, she hasn't been told anything? LOL. So, yeah, I told her the administrative office would be in touch about her placement. She doesn't know the nature of the review." "Good." Broadhurst stood up. "Let's keep it basically. Eyes that way, until we've something more definitive. I don't want noise." "Neither do I." They moved to the door together, and Broadhurst stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at Calloway with the expression of a man who was about to say something that wasn't quite a compliment, and not a compliment. "You changed the checkpoint this morning," he said. "The East Wing exterior, which is cool." "Routine rotation?" Calloway said. Broadhurst looked, at him for a moment. "Right," he said, and went out. The second significant thing that happened that morning happened at 11:40, which was the point at which the day had been moving along its surface with enough normalcy that the people responsible for maintaining it had begun, fractionally, to relax. Not Calloway. He didn't relax in that way. It wasn't a capacity he had. But some of the broader ambient tension that had been running through the household staff since the morning briefing had begun to settle. People had returned to their routines. The correspondence room was quiet. The residential wing was calm. What happened at 11:40 was small. It was, in the way of all important small things, easy to miss if you weren't already looking. A member of the household domestic staff, a woman who had worked at Windsor for 7 years, and who was by any measure a thoroughly known and trusted presence, mentioned in passing to A junior colleague in the linen room, that she had spoken to the new temporary assistant that morning, briefly, just a hello in the corridor, and that the woman had asked her a question. Nothing remarkable, just a question about the family's schedule for the afternoon, whether the children would be indoors or taking their walk in the garden as usual on Wednesdays. The junior colleague mentioned this to nobody because it sounded like nothing. But the woman in the linen room turned it over in her mind for the next 20 minutes while she sorted towels, and at the end of 20 minutes, she walked down to the administrative corridor and knocked on the door of the small room where she knew Calloway sometimes worked, and she told him what she had just told you. He listened honestly to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said thank you and meant it in the brief, genuine way he occasionally allowed himself. And she left, and he sat with it for approximately 40 seconds before he stood up and walked with purpose down the corridor toward the east wing. The children's afternoon garden walk was a known element of the Wednesday routine. Charlotte and Louis walked the east garden path after lunch on most Wednesdays when they were in residence. A simple thing, 25 minutes, accompanied by 2 members of protection, and usually by their mother. It wasn't a secret, or which it appeared on the internal schedule. It was the kind of detail that a person with legitimate staff access might encounter in the ordinary course of correspondence processing. It was also the kind of detail that a person who was gathering information would want to confirm in advance. The question that someone had asked in the corridor wasn't a casual question. Calloway reached the correspondence room and knocked once and opened the door. Diane Marsh was at her workstation, unprocessing folders, her head down. She looked up when he came in, and her face went through its performance again. That quick, practiced transition to neutrality. But this time, it moved less smoothly. There was a tell in it now, a faint overcorrection, the eyes settling a beat too late. "In my opinion, Ms. Marsh," he said, "and I need to ask you to come with me, please." And honestly, and she set down the folder she was holding with a deliberateness that would have looked like calm to anyone who didn't know what forced, calm looked like. "Is there a problem?" "We're conducting a routine review of temporary placements," he said, which wasn't a lie and wasn't the whole truth. "It won't, take long." She came with him. She had no choice, and she understood she had no choice. But the way she walked, slightly ahead of herself, a micro lean forward of someone calculating options, told him what he needed to know about whether she understood why. The room they went to wasn't the small administrative space. It was the formal security review room on the ground floor, which had a different quality to it. 2 chairs set across from each other, with a table between, institutional lighting, a camera in the upper corner that anyone with any knowledge of how these things worked would recognize immediately. Calloway, TBH. I gestured to one of the chairs. She sat. He sat across from her and put a single sheet of paper on the table between them. He, didn't look at the paper. He looked at her. "We've been, reviewing the approval process for your current placement," he said. "There are a few items I'd like your help clarifying." Not gonna lie, she looked at the paper and then at him, and the performance held. But it was holding harder now, the way something holds when it started to understand the weight being put on it. "Actually, of course," she said. He asked her about the employment gap first. Not aggressively, just the way you ask a question when you already have half the answer, and you want to know if the person will give you the other half honestly. She said it was private consulting. He asked what kind. She said corporate administrative support. He asked for the client name. which she said she wasn't able to provide it due to a non-disclosure agreement. He wrote that to be fair, down on the paper, slowly, and she watched him write it. And the watching had that particular quality of someone who's deciding, in real time, how much truth to trade for how much time. He asked about the conversation in the corridor. She went still in a way that was different from her previous stillness. Not the stillness of control, but the stillness of something that has been caught. Just, for a moment. Then she said she didn't know what he was referring to. I guess he described it. She said she may have asked a colleague something. She couldn't remember exactly. She was just being friendly. He looked at her. Outside the room, in the main corridor, Broadhurst was on the phone. The content of that call was moving through the building's communication channels in the quiet, efficient way of something that had been set in motion correctly, not running, or not scrambling, just operating with the steady momentum of a system that had been built to handle exactly this kind of situation, and was now doing so. Charlotte, upstairs, had returned to the study, and she and Mrs. Harding had resumed the lesson without discussing the break. They were doing pretty much, reading now, a chapter from a book Charlotte had been working through for 2 weeks, a story about a girl who goes on a very long journey, and keeps encountering people who are not what they appear to be, which Charlotte had thought was just an adventure story when she started it, and was now beginning to suspect was about something else. She read a paragraph and stopped. "Mrs. For what it's worth, Harding," she said. The woman looked up. "That woman I saw yesterday in the corridor," Charlotte said, she's still here?" Mrs. Harding held her gaze with the same expression from that morning. Open, not performed. "Thought she's, being dealt with," she said. Charlotte looked at her for a moment, and then looked back at her book. "Okay," she said, which she found her place on the page and read on. Outside the window, the October garden held its pale, precise light, and the gardener near the yew hedge had moved on to the next bed, and everything looked orderly, and everything looked as it was supposed to look, and underneath the surface of it, in the quiet, saw a careful way of people who had devoted their professional lives to this specific form of vigilance. The machinery was doing what it had been built to do. In the Look security review room on the ground floor, Calloway asked Diane Marsh one more question. He asked, in my opinion, her what was in her coat pocket. The coat was still on her. She had kept it on through the whole conversation, the way people keep something close that they know they shouldn't have kept close. The question landed on her like the kind of thing you feel before you hear it, the way a wave arrives as a pressure change in your chest before it arrives as water. She said nothing for 4 seconds. Then she reached into her pocket and put the second phone on the table. Calloway looked at it and then looked at her and didn't say anything either, because there wasn't anything left that needed to be said. Pretty much. The phone sat on the table between them in the institutional light of the review room, and the room was very quiet. And the morning, which had begun with mist on the stone paths and a gardener moving along the flower beds, and a 9-year-old girl sitting down to French verbs, continued to move through itself toward its conclusion. What Calloway felt in that moment, if he felt anything, and he would later say only that he remained focused on the procedural requirements of the situation, wasn't triumph. It was the thing that comes after the tuning fork stops, the particular quiet honestly of a note that is finally resolved. He reached forward and picked up the phone. Outside, the afternoon TBH was beginning its slow turn toward the cooler light of late October, and somewhere above him, past the floors and the ceilings and the long corridors of Windsor, the girl was reading about a long journey and the people who turned out not to be what they appeared, and coming steadily, at her own pace, toward the end of the chapter. By 2 p.m, Diane Marsh was gone from the building. No announcement. No scene. She was escorted to the staff exit by 2 members of the security team who walked beside her with the calm and total authority of people who don't need to raise their voices because the situation has already been decided. And she went with them in the same compressed quiet she had maintained through the entire morning, and the door closed behind her, and that was that. Her kind of workstation was cleared within the hour. The temporary access card was deactivated. The chair where she had sat was occupied by nobody. The building went on, around the absence without pausing for it. That kind of was the particular nature of Windsor. It was old enough, and had absorbed enough, and that it didn't register disruption the way a normal household would. Events settled into its walls the way everything settled into its walls, and the surface of the day resumed. The corridors continued to be walked, and the clocks on the mantelpieces continued their indifferent metering of the hours. What didn't simply, settle and resume was the investigation into how she had gotten there. Broadhurst had moved the matter upward through the appropriate channels within the first 20 minutes of the phone being placed on the table in the review room, and by the time the afternoon had reached its halfway point, there were 3 separate lines of inquiry running through the protective security apparatus. One into the secondary approval channel and the person who had used it. One into the employment history and the connection to the media organization. And one, the quietest and most carefully managed of the 3, into exactly what information might have been gathered during Marsh's 2 days on the premises and what could have moved through the second phone that wasn't the phone on the desk. Calloway wasn't running those lines of inquiry. His job was the day-to-day protection of the principals, and his job continued regardless of what else was running alongside it. He did his afternoon sweep of the East Wing. He confirmed the route for the Wednesday garden walk, which had been moved without announcement to the West Garden. A simple internal adjustment, logged only in the tight circle of people who needed to know. He verified that both of the exterior checkpoints were properly positioned. He received a brief status update from Reed and sent a brief status update back. He stood for about 3 minutes, some at the window of the staircase landing that had given him sight lines to both corridors that morning, and looked out at the West Garden, where the last of the good October light was moving slowly across the grass. And then he went back to work. The garden walk happened at 2:30. Charlotte came down the interior stairs with her brother Louis, who was 6, and primarily concerned that afternoon with a running dispute he was having with Charlotte about whether a particular beetle he had found the previous day constituted a discovery that merited some form of official recognition. Charlotte's position was that it didn't, which Louis's position was that Charlotte was wrong about most things. They argued about this through the corridor and out the side door and into the West Garden with the thoroughness of children who have found a topic that offers them the significant structural pleasure of being completely certain they're right. Their mother was with them. She had come in from a morning of correspondence and a lunch meeting that had run slightly long, and she was in that particular state of recalibration that Catherine often wore in the transition between her public self and her private one. Not tired exactly, but carrying something, the specific weight of sustained performance in the process of being set down. She listened to the beetle dispute with half her attention and let her eyes move across the garden the way they moved when she was decompressing, when taking in the ordinary, with a gratitude for the ordinary that she would have been hard-pressed to explain to anyone who hadn't spent a significant portion of their life performing under observation. Calloway was honestly 20 feet back. Reed was at the garden entrance. 2 additional officers, basically, had the perimeter. The West Garden sat under the best of the late afternoon, and the 4 of them walked along the path, Charlotte and Louis still arguing, Catherine half listening and half not. It looked like TBH, what it was, which was a family on a walk on a Wednesday in October, and it also looked like what Calloway and Reed and the others were making it look like, which was safe. Those 2 things were the same thing, They were always, at their best, the same thing. Charlotte was quiet for part of the walk. She had finished her reading lesson, and the book was still in her mind. The journey, and the people who weren't what they appeared. And the particular satisfaction of the ending, which wasn't that the traveler figured everything out, but that she learned, somewhere along the way, to trust what she felt before she could explain what she felt. Charlotte had sat with that ending for the last 20 minutes of the lesson and thought that it was probably the truest thing she had read all term. She glanced back once at Calloway, the way she occasionally did, quickly, and without making anything of it. He was where he always was, the same distance back, the same watchful stillness. His face was the same locked door it always was. She turned back to the path. "You're not even listening," Lewis said. One more thing. I said the beetle had markings, distinctive ones. I think. All beetles have markings. Lewis, not like these." She looked at him, and he was looking up at her with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who has decided that the physical evidence of the universe supports his position. And she thought, and this was a very Charlotte thing to think, that the most consistently interesting thing about her brother wasn't that he was wrong about things, but that he was wrong about things with such complete conviction that it became structurally indistinguishable from being right. Fine," she said. "Show me the beetle." He looked at her to see if she was being sarcastic. She held the neutral face she had been practicing since approximately age 5. He decided to take it at face value and launched into a description of the beetle's exact location, which was under the stone beside the yew hedge, which was in the east garden, which wasn't where they were walking. "Tomorrow," Catherine said, from just behind them. "Beetle investigation tomorrow." Louis accepted this with the pragmatism of someone who has learned that certain authority figures are worth arguing with. Certain sort of are not, and moved on to explaining, without any transitional prompt, his current theory about the deepest part of the ocean. Charlotte walked and listened, and felt the afternoon around her, the cool of it, the smell of the cut grass, and the cold that was beginning to come into the air at the edges of the day, the light at its particular October angle that made even the flat lawn look dimensional and slightly golden. She was 9 years old, and she was a princess, and she lived inside one of the most scrutinized and protected and publicly theorized about families in the world, and none of that was the thing she was thinking about. She was thinking about the beetle investigation. She was thinking about whether the traveler in her book would go on another journey. She was thinking about the question she still hadn't finished asking her brother. She thought briefly about the morning, about the woman she had seen, and the pressure change feeling when something shifted, and the way Mrs. Harding had looked at her with the unsmiled expression that was just a person looking. Then she let it go, not because she had resolved it. She hadn't. Not fully, and she understood that she probably wouldn't get the full story, but because that was the other ambient truth of her life, that the full story was always being managed at a level just above where she currently stood. But because the afternoon was here, and her brother was talking, and her mother was walking behind them at the pace of someone who was for a few minutes simply a person in a garden, and the ground was solid under her feet, and Calloway was 20 feet back, and the day was intact. That was enough for now. She knew how to carry the rest. 3 floors actually up, in the formal security review room that was now empty and quiet, the second phone sat. In an evidence bag on the table, logged and labeled, and waiting for the next stage of the process. Broadhurst would brief the relevant parties that evening. The inquiry into the secondary approval channel would run its course over the coming weeks with the thorough, bureaucratically invisible efficiency. That characterized how the palace handled these things when they were handled correctly. Names would be followed, connections would be mapped, which the media organization would come under a pressure it wouldn't be able to see the source of. These things would take time, and wouldn't make headlines, because the entire point was that they'd make headlines. What had already happened, the part that was complete, and the part that had been done correctly and in time, was Calloway standing in a corridor before. Anything could reach the people it was meant to reach. That part was done. Calloway, TBH, walked the perimeter of the West Garden at 3:05, when the family had gone back inside, and the afternoon had begun its quiet fold into early evening. And he did his final check of the East Wing exterior points, and confirmed that both were properly staffed, and that the adjusted checkpoint position had been noted and would remain as placed. He signed off on the afternoon log. He had a cup of tea, black, at the small table in the staff room at the end of his shift, and he sat there for approximately 6 minutes without reading anything or checking his phone, which was, for Calloway, the equivalent of a very thorough rest. Reed came in and at the end of those 6 minutes, and sat across from him and said, "Good morning." "Good morning," he said, even though it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. She poured herself tea and looked at the table for a moment. "The phone's been sent to technical review." "Real talk. Good." Broadhurst called it a clean intercept. He looked at his cup. "You don't want the compliment," she said, not as a question. "I want to know how the secondary channel was accessed." She nodded. "Fair." They look. I sat with their tea for a minute, and the staff room was warm and quiet, and outside the window, the October evening was coming down in its slow, enormous way over the grounds, the dark arriving at the edges first, and then moving inward, the way dark always does, unhurried, certain of its eventual arrival. "The checkpoint," Reed said. "What about it? Which is cool. Moving at 30 feet. You did that before you had anything definitive." "The thing is, he didn't say anything." "I'm just noting it," she said. "Noted," he said. Well, she drank her tea. There was a thing about people who were very good at the kind of work Calloway did, which was that the work mostly consisted of preventing the story from happening. This made it, by definition, a kind of labor that could not be fully seen. Because the story that didn't happen left no record of itself, no visible shape, no moment of resolution that announced itself clearly as resolution. What you were left with, at the end of a day like this one, was an ordinary afternoon in a West Garden. A boy explaining the ocean's depths with unearned confidence. A girl walking a path, thinking about a book. A mother carrying the receding weight of a long day and feeling, without articulating it, the specific relief of her children being intact beside her. That was for what it's worth, the whole of what there was to show. Calloway finished his tea and rinsed the cup and put it upside down on the rack. He checked his phone once, nothing requiring a response, and put it back in his pocket. He gathered his Mars coat from the hook and put it on with the methodical absence of thought of a person who has done this thousands of times and expects to do it thousands more. At the door, he paused, the way he occasionally did, for no reason anyone watching could have identified. Then he went home. On the second floor of the palace, the correspondence room was empty and clean, the workstation cleared, and the filing cabinets aligned, the temporary visitor lanyard sitting coiled on the corner of the desk where someone had left it. The hook behind, the filing cabinet held nothing. The door stood ajar in the quiet corridor. From somewhere further, in my opinion, in the building came the distant, ordinary sounds of a household in its evening. A door, footsteps, a low exchange of voices, the sound of water running, the sounds of people living. The stone, I think, walls of Windsor held all of it. The morning and the afternoon, and the thing that had been moving through it, and the thing that had been placed quietly in its path. The walls held it all, and said nothing about any of it, the way walls do, the way old walls do especially, the ones. that have been absorbing the weight of what happens inside them for longer than anyone currently living can remember or imagine. In the east garden, the yew hedge stood dark and dense against the evening sky, and beneath the stone beside it, under the right stone, Louis was absolutely certain of this, a beetle sat. In the particular oblivious magnificence of something that does not know it's been found, and waits for tomorrow and the investigation that is coming, with the patient confidence of something that has nowhere else to be. Like the palace was quiet, the day was done, and everyone inside it was safe. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it always had to be enough, because the work that made it so was never going to be visible in the way that the safe afternoon was visible, warm and ordinary, and briefly golden in the last of the October light. It was only ever going to be the ground beneath it, the steady, invisible ground, the thing that had to hold for any of the rest of it to stand. I mean, it held. It always, for what it's worth, held, when the right people were paying attention. And tonight, as the lamps came on in the residential wing one by one, and the last of the light finished its slow departure from the gardens, and the household settled into the unguarded rhythms of its evening, it held because of 11 years of attention compressed into one morning, and one corridor, and one man standing in exactly the right place, for exactly the right reason, at exactly the right time. No announcement and no headlines. No story in the end, because the story was what had been prevented. The real story was always the one that didn't happen. The, shape of what was kept from arriving. The door that stayed locked. Plus, the path that ended before it reached what it was walking toward. Charlotte would go to sleep that night in her room, in the residential wing, and she wouldn't know the full version of what had moved through the day around her. Not yet. Maybe not for years. Maybe not in the way that people who write these things down think of as knowing. But to be fair, and she would carry forward in the part of her that had always been paying attention, a kind of knowledge that didn't need to be named to be real. The knowledge that the ground was held, that the machinery worked, that somewhere in the corridors of the place she had grown up in, people were watching with a quality of attention so complete and so continuous that it became, in its own way, a form of love. She would sleep, and the palace would be quiet, and in the morning, Calloway would start his sweep again, and it would begin the way most mornings do inside these walls, with a practiced calm, a rehearsed peace, the surface of an ordinary day lying over everything that was always, invisibly, underneath it. And underneath it, the ground would hold.